Welcome to Nature Revisited, a podcast that explores our relationship with the natural world. It consists of interviews, stories, and discussions that highlight the notion that nature is not a place one goes to, but rather a place one is already a part of, that we are nature. For those of you who are new to the podcast, my name is Stefan Van Norden, and thank you, everyone, for joining me. On this episode, Desert Earth, I am joined by Paul Nabhan, who is a desert ecologist, plant conservationist, and nature writer, who has written numerous books and articles about the desert and desert culture, and who is the editor of the wonderful book, The Nature of Desert Nature. Gary, who joins me from his home in southern Arizona, near the Mexican border, has been connected to the desert and desert culture his whole life. Gary, welcome back to Nature Revisited. It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast again. This time, talking about the importance and the culture of desert earth and how deserts and arid places can and must help shape the course of our future.
Well, thank you. I really enjoy these questions and you raising the issue of how deserts can mean something to our future and to people who don't live in a desert today.
I would like to start this episode with a poem from your book, The Nature of Desert Nature, by Patricia Mora. The desert is no lady.
Yes, thank you so much. Pat Mora has been a friend of mine for 30 years, and she's just a national treasure. And here's how that wonderful poem goes. The desert is no lady. She screams at the spring sky, dances with her skirts high, kicks sand, flings tumbleweeds, digs her nails into all flesh. Her unveiled lust fascinates even the sun.
Thank you. So let's begin with how you might define a desert.
The definitions of desert are oddly something that puzzles me because it's the only ecosystem or biome in the world that's defined by what it lacks rather than what it has. For me, a desert is a place that has root-based communities below ground and interactions between plants and animals that show diversity that few people see the first time they notice a desert. So deserts have been typically defined by their temperatures. There are hot and cold deserts. Antarctica sometimes is called a desert. And the paucity of available moisture. If it's locked up in ice, like it is in Antarctica, that moisture may not be available to plants. But most of our deserts in Western North America have low and intermittent rainfall that creates a soil water deficit. So those are the basic historical definitions of a desert that in some ways I dispute.
So how would you explain why you're so fascinated by deserts?
Well, I think for the personal one that my family is of Arab heritage, and there are ancestors in Yemen, Oman, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon that have had a huge impact on world culture through understanding a desert and providing its unique products to people who live in other regions. But I'm also interested in deserts because they're the laboratory of the future. It's not just my own personal historic past. 2/5 of the Earth's land surface is already desert, and that percentage is going up year by year. And so, to some extent, all of us can learn from the way life organizes itself into communities and landscapes in deserts, because that will be the precursor or the analog to conditions that much of the world's population will be facing in a relatively short period of time.
So just how unique and diverse are desert ecosystems?
Let's look at those two words, uniqueness and diversity. First of all, different ecosystems or landscapes are usually compared by the total number of species above ground, plants and animals, that can be easily counted. Deserts rank relatively low if that's the sole indicator of what a landscape or ecosystem is worth. We find that many desert plants and animals are only found in a small area exclusively in deserts. One of my friends defined desert plants as plants that grow where others can't. The word that scientists have for this kind of phenomena is endemism. So there's a relatively high number of plants unique only to deserts. In the deserts, most of them have restricted ranges because they're so finely adapted to a particular place, and they're not like one-size-fits-all plants that you can grow everywhere from coast to coast.
So can you describe some of the sounds and smells from the desert that you have connected with?
Well, Stefan, I love this question. I wake up each morning to the sound of white-winged doves and mourning doves cooing as the owls begin to quiet down. And at the same time, we hear cactus wrens and Gila woodpeckers beginning to do their rattles. And then bring in the hawks and the thrashers and the mockingbirds, and we, in short order, have a symphony among us. But there's another that is going on at the same time, and that's one not of sound, but of scent, of what Harold McGee calls the osmocosm, the world of fragrances that plants and animals use to communicate. Deserts probably have the greatest number of fragrant chemicals and the highest intensities or densities of those chemicals, because they need those volatile oils that produce the fragrances to protect themselves from damaging radiation, from water loss, and from browsing by desert animals. So the scents of the desert are something beyond belief, especially when the rainy season comes in June or July, where suddenly you're overwhelmed by 30 or 40 plants that have been emitting oils onto their leaves for months, and suddenly those oils are washed into the air, and you feel like a tidal wave of delicious, sweet, bizarre fragrances hitting your nose, mouth, and lungs almost immediately. So both the sounds and the scents of deserts are really unique.
Why do you think that deserts are more often defined by what they lack rather than by what they offer?
It simply may be an issue of how Europe colonized North America or South America. The conquerors, the conquistadors, the explorers, the missionaries came from well-watered places into places where they saw more open space. As they moved westward from the Atlantic Ocean toward the Rocky Mountains, that it got increasingly drier, the trees became shorter, and they adopted an old view of deserts from the Middle East that called them desolate or abandoned places, the root meaning of our word desert. At the same time, the native people of deserts called them shimmering places, because in the morning the spines and hairs and prickles on cacti and other plants gleam in the sun, and indigenous people feel it's the most beautiful place on earth because it literally glows as you wake up in the morning. So it's all about where we come from and how we open ourselves to other landscapes.
In your book, you talk about the debate between competition and cooperation in the desert. Why is that debate so important to understanding deserts?
First, let me give your listeners a little historic perspective on that debate. With Darwinism, people thought because of the relative scarcity of water and some food resources in the desert, that it was all about nature, tooth, and claw, that you had to compete for your neighbors for basic resources or you would die. So the survival of the fittest, rather than imagining that the plants and animals in the desert are living together cooperatively. And a Russian scientist, Kropotkin, first raised the issue of how in places with scarce resources, you actually have a drive to collaborate more among players to avoid conflict. And this is absolutely true with Sonoran desert plants and animals, that we have more symbiotic relationships or mutualisms between plants and their pollinators, seed dispersers, than nearly any other landscape or ecosystem in the world. Many of the cacti, like the Sinita cactus, has a moth that spends its entire life cycle on the same species of plant. It lays its eggs, and the seed pods are in the flesh of the plant. When it becomes a moth, it feeds on the nectar of the flowers, and then it begins that life cycle again, and it's protected by the thick tissues of the plant from heat and damaging radiation. And yucca is one of the first plants that we knew of that had a symbiotic relationship with the nocturnal moth. And I could keep on naming examples, but that's only speaking of the plant-pollinator relationships alone. So I think the major message about deserts is that most of its good graces are hidden from view. And if we take them into account, we see much more evidence of cooperation than competition. And in another way, competition and cooperation are two sides of a coin, that you may compete for the same flower, but the flower is there to give both pollinators nectar, and by visiting the flower, they're helping fertilize the flower so that seeds can be set. So the whole idea that deserts are only about competition has fallen by the wayside, but I don't deny that there's sort of a creative tension between competition and cooperation during times of stress in deserts.
As you have alluded to, deserts are places of enchantment and wonder, even sacred. What are some of the ways, in your experience, that the desert has shaped your spirituality?
From nearly every religion in the world, hermits, spiritual pilgrims have ventured into deserts to anchor their contemplative practice in desert mountaintops or around desert oases or in secluded canyons and caves. So At one very, very deep level, the spiritual practice that I have that I call desert spirituality as a Franciscan brother is even more ancient than Christianity or Judaism or Buddhism. It predates all of those. I'm particularly drawn to deserts for additional reasons. Like I said, I'm Arab American. My family here in the United States are refugees from greater Syria that includes Lebanon, Syria, and parts of Jordan and Palestine. So I have that affinity to stories that my grandfather told me of him growing up. But I also moved to the Sonoran Desert at the ripe old age of 20 and have seldom left it for more than 3 months of time since then. I feel that the desert offers me the capacity to interact with communities of both plants and animals and people that are about adapting their whole lifestyles or livelihoods that gives them a more abundant life rather than an impoverished one. And so I've had the good fortune of living and working with the Tohono Nations people that used to be called Papagos and the Comcop Nation people on the Gulf of California coast that used to be called the Seri. And many of these people live in habitats of 4 inches of rainfall or less, and they survive graciously and gratefully without feeling that they're lacking anything. And I think that's the trouble that most contemplatives are trying to deal with. How do we get over feeling that a place is inadequate or that we ourselves are inadequate and accept any place or any person for who or what they are?
So in many cultures, the use of story is very important in sharing their history, their knowledge, and their wisdom. Just how important is story to most desert cultures?
I love to think about story as being an anchor, that the memory of past potential ways of living or dealing with challenges provides people with a toolkit for solving problems that's better than any workshop of a mechanic or a woodworker, because you can keep it in your head. That toolkit is mobile. You carry the stories with you, and they provide you with strategies for living. And so we know that when people are given a narrative story about a certain event by a great oral storyteller versus reading the same content in a factual, didactic tone in a newspaper textbook, people remember the storytelling far longer than the more didactic text because it gives you images, not just words. And stories from 170 years ago still guide the Comcop or Seri people that I was just visiting in Mexico in their daily lives and how they decide to welcome, resist, or repel intrusions by outsiders, tourists or colonizers or economic oppressors. And so it really is like a multi-generational encyclopedia about ways of living in the world that they can draw upon. People sit around campfires or drink desert teas or coffee late into the night, still telling stories with a precision that's astonishing, but they can recall events in much the same way that their grandparents talked about those same events. And those grandparents were speaking of events that had happened 100 years before their own birth. By repeated storytelling of the same event, stories lodge in your imagination, and then you bring them up whenever you face a similar challenge in your own life.
So as you know, last year, the Southwest and Mexico experienced some of the highest temperatures on record, with Phoenix reaching at or above 110 for 31 straight days. And this year, scientists are predicting more of the same. So who are being affected most adversely by these rising temperatures?
Well, there's a lot of compassion hidden in that question and a lot of anguish lying at the bottom of it as well. The people most affected are the ones who we would call materially poor, but culturally and spiritually rich. People who live on the margins of our society and on the margins of landscapes. When Arizona was colonized, the Spanish, later the Mexicans and Anglos, usurped the places with the most water, and the indigenous people in many cases had to flee to more poorly watered places where it was harder to make a living. People who live part of the year inland and part of the year on coastlines were forced to make a decision about whether they lived exclusively on the coastlines and let the inlands be farmed and made into ranches, or whether they left the coastal areas to live in fishing villages and even more remote places. So ocean level rising is affecting those people on the coastlines in ways I can tangibly see, where literally the houses of friends I used to see 5 or 6 times a year when I came down to spend weeks with Comtac Indian people in Punta Chueca, Sonora, those houses have now fallen into the sea. Each year when hurricane fringe storms come across from Baja California and hit the Sonoran coast, more and more houses are being knocked down and then torn apart, and standing water is being left in the desert for 3 or 4 weeks, creating epidemics of malaria and chikungunya and other insect vector diseases that never came into the deserts before this increased intensity of storms that comes with climate change, and also to keep tropical mosquitoes and tropical diseases moving northward now well into the United States. And so we've seen that the desert used to be a sort of safeguard against tropical diseases and pests, and now it no longer is, because we may not get any rain for 2 years, and then we may get 10 inches in a matter of days, like I saw in the Mojave Desert last fall. So this change in the severity of climatic events, when we get up to 125 to 130 degrees, like we are in Nevada and California and Arizona now, we also have increasingly high death rates of farm workers and other outdoor workers. Last year, 2023, in the United States, but especially in the border states, we had 30,000 more deaths of outdoor workers than in any year in recorded history. 30,000 additional deaths of farm workers and other outdoor workers. So the heat and the thirst, the desiccation, the damaging solar radiation, the vulnerability to heat stroke, heat shock, and muscle wasting are taking their toll on anyone who is so poor that they can't afford to be in 24-hour-a-day air conditioning.
So when heat causes desert conditions to expand, does a desert ecosystems expand with it, or does the heat just create wastelands?
Immediately wastelands, because there's a time lag before the desert plants that are adapted to those conditions are dispersed into those areas. There's a time lag before trees either resprout from their trunks or are recruited from seeds in the soil. Some ecosystems are set back for hundreds of years if the cacti and the desert trees that have endured for centuries are suddenly wiped out and there's no immediate recruitment. That's why we're involved in a kind of ecological restoration here where I live and indigenous communities each year in the deserts of Mexico. We call it biocultural restoration because the cultural knowledge of those communities guides the restoration of everything from mesquite trees and cacti inland to mangroves and seagrasses just off their shores. To restore those lands and waters, we must restore them. We must remember the old stories about those places and use them to guide any work, realizing that the conditions that we knew that made those places habitats of abundance historically have also shifted. So you never do ecological restoration in a way that's trying to create a clone of what you saw when you were younger or what the first conquistadors saw when they came to the North American deserts. You always have to think out into the future, but still use the guidance of the past. It's a place I call planet desert. Like I said, it foreshadows what most of us will be facing in the future. But if we learn from the lessons of desert cultures and desert plants, rather than ignoring them, we have the capacity to live in balance. I am launching a new project this month. I launched it on Earth Day at Harvard called the Sacred Lands Biocultural Recovery Initiative. We're focusing on the sacred and ceremonial plants of desert cultures as a means to bring scientists and people of faith together to save, restore, and perhaps make more abundant again the sacred plants that have underlain spiritual traditions, not only of indigenous cultures, but Catholic, Jewish, Buddhist, and Muslim cultures. And these plants are really in trouble. So we're trying to begin a healing initiative that would bring people together of diverse faiths to begin to restore and restore the desert. And people can read about that initiative on www.garynabhan.com.
So lastly, there is so much we still need to know about deserts. How important is our understanding of deserts to our future?
It's of immense significance. Most sustainable agriculture as we know it in North America is bound to fail if they don't take in the knowledge of desert farmers, particularly in the western two-thirds of the United States, is facing drought. We no longer have the groundwater, which is really fossil water put down 10,000 years or more ago, to artificially cool off and water those areas. We're going to have to grow things that are adapted to the desert rather than remaking the desert to fit water-hungry crops. And so the concept that's most useful to me is biomimicry. How can we look at an assemblage of plants in a desert, what we call nurse plant guilds, where a nitrogen-fixing legume tree with a dense canopy like mesquite or ironwood provides a sheltered environment in which different kinds of cacti, flowering shrubs, annual herbs of medicinal value and food value, and root crops all grow under that protective canopy that serves like a shelter or sanctuary for vulnerable seedlings. So we can use that nurse plant guild of desert plants as a model for agroforestry systems that produce 5 or 6 kinds of crops on the same amount of land that mature at different times of the year and use far less energy and water. And if I haven't said it clearly before, let me just say that we're out of fresh water. We have 140 rivers in the world that no longer flow out to the ocean. So we cannot farm as we have done the last 100 years. And so we're really at a tipping point where we either start paying attention to the wisdom of the deserts, or much of our food economy and our society will be in dire straits from here on out. The desert is no lady. She screams at the spring sky, dances with her skirts high, kicks sand, flings tumbleweeds, digs her nails into all flesh. Her unveiled lust fascinates even the sun.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Gary Paul Nabhan, and that if you are interested in learning more about deserts and desert life, you read the book, The Nature of Desert Nature, and visit Gary's website, GaryNabhan.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please share with friends, family, and colleagues. You can follow Nature Revisited on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, or our website, nordenproductions.com. I would also like to invite you to share your comments and ideas, and even suggestions for future guests for Nature Revisited on the comment section of this episode on our website. The music for Nature Revisited is Tim Buckley, Buzz and Fly. Nature Revisited is produced by Stefan Van Norden and Charles Gagan, and I hope you will join me for the next edition of Nature Revisited. And in the meantime, do remember, we are nature.